welcomes you all this evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I've prepared a special collection of night shift stories for you to enjoy. So, sit back, relax, and let the darkness take over as we dive into some chilling tales that are sure to send a shiver down your spine. The Silent Watcher's story. I never thought much about the job. I was just a 24-year-old guy trying to make a living. The job was at a chemical manufacturing plant, deep in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. It was a place so far off the beaten path that when you looked around, the only things you saw were endless trees and hills, not a single sign of civilization for miles. I'd been hired as a head of security, a job I thought would be a simple desk job with minimal action. The plant was secluded, old, and surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire. The only real threats were trespassers and the occasional disgruntled ex-employee. But it wasn't long before I realized that this plant had secrets, and those secrets had a way of crawling out at night when the world was quiet and still. I wasn't alone in the facility. I had a colleague, Dean, who'd been with the company for just under a year. Dean was the kind of guy who took his job a little too seriously. He wore the uniform as if it was armor, and he was meticulous about everything. He even walked with a certain precision that made him seem almost robotic. He was younger than me, barely 21, and this was his first real security gig, so it made sense that he'd want to impress the higher-ups. As for me, I'd been here for a few years and had learned to take it easy. The occasional walk through the plant, checking cameras every hour, maybe making sure there were no late-night deliveries. Routine stuff. The plant itself was divided into a few sections. The front had offices and employee parking. And beyond that was the production floor, where various chemicals were manufactured and stored. The back housed two giant warehouses, one for regular chemicals and one for highly flammable materials. Outside, beyond the warehouses, were towering silos that loomed over the property. The silos stored raw materials, and we had to make sure their tops were sealed tight, especially during the night. On a night in December of 2020, everything started to change. The shift started out like any other. Dean and I were talking over the radio, coordinating our rounds, discussing the usual minutiae of the job. I was in my office, scrolling through forums on my laptop, enjoying some dipping tobacco, while Dean was in the parking lot checking the perimeter. It wasn't until I heard the radio crackle that things began to feel off. "Hey, Alex," came Dean's voice. "You hear anything on the cameras?" I thought I heard movement in the warehouse. I glanced at my monitor. Nothing unusual. Just static, the usual quiet hum of the cameras. "Nope, don't see anything," I replied, my eyes still glued to the screen. "It's probably just the ventilation kicking in. You know how it is." "Yeah, you're probably right," Dean said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. I dismissed it and went back to my internet browsing. It was just another slow night, or so I thought. A few minutes later, the motion sensor alarm for the receiving dock went off. The beep sounded sharp in my ears. I grabbed my radio. "Dean, you see a truck out there?" The motion sensor just went off. Dean's voice came back, tinged with confusion. "No truck here, man. Are you sure the sensor's working?" I frowned. "Yeah, it's definitely working. I'm going to head over to the gate and make sure the trucker's not trying to get in. Go ahead and check the cameras, I'll be back in a minute." I turned off my radio, walked out of my office, and made my way across the plant. The production floor was dark, with only the emergency exit lights casting faint shadows on the concrete walls. As I passed the forklifts parked in their charging stations, I heard a clang, a loud metallic noise that echoed across the floor. It was strange. I paused, my hand on the door, listening. Nothing. I shook my head. Probably something falling from a shelf or the ventilation system again. No. Big deal. I continued my walk across the building. My mind wandered to how much time I had left on my shift. 6 hours to go. It was going to be a long night. When I returned to the office, I turned my radio back on. "Hey, Dean, you hear that clang just now?" He didn't respond immediately. I waited, tapping my fingers on the desk. Finally, his voice crackled through the speaker. End quote. "No, man, I'm out walking the perimeter right now. I'm going to go on break when I'm done. You good?" "Yeah, I'm good," I said. "I'll make my rounds in a few minutes, then check the warehouses. You know the drill." I sat back in my chair, a slight unease creeping in, but I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the darkness outside, or the eerie silence of the plant. As I checked the warehouse cameras, I noticed something odd. One of the cameras in the back warehouse seemed to be malfunctioning. The image flickered and cut out for a moment before coming back on. I brushed it off. A simple technical glitch. I grabbed my clipboard and made my way down the long corridor that led to the back warehouse. The air smelled strange, almost sulfuric. I frowned, stepping inside. It wasn't the usual chemical smell that I was accustomed to. It was a sharp, unpleasant odor. I had never noticed it before, and it made my stomach turn. I continued my rounds, walking through the aisles of barrels and crates. I stopped at the far corner where we stored the non-flammable chemicals, lit a cigarette, and exhaled a cloud of smoke. Then, I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, and coming from behind me. I turned quickly, expecting to see Dean walking toward me, but the aisle was empty. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease. End quote, just the exhaustion, end quote, I muttered to myself. But then, the radio crackled again, this time with static. I couldn't hear anything through it, except for white noise. It seemed to last for longer than usual before the transmission cut off completely. I tried to reach Dean, but he didn't answer. I felt a surge of irritation and a creeping sense of fear. "Dean? You there?" I called again, but there was no response. I headed for the back exit, walking through the heavy metal doors. The rain had started coming down harder, tapping against the windows, and the wind was picking up. I had to check the silos before heading back inside. The rain made the metal staircase slick, and I cursed under my breath as I climbed the tall structure, checking the seals at the top. The wind howled around me, and I could feel the temperature drop. Something wasn't right. As I descended, the radio crackled again. This time, it was much worse, full of static and screeches. It wouldn't stop. I looked up and saw something move out of the corner of my eye, a dark figure darting behind one of the silos. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. Was someone here? A trespasser? I turned on my flashlight and pointed it in that direction, my pulse racing. The light caught something in the distance, Dean, running toward me, his face pale as a sheet. "Dean?" I shouted, rushing toward him. He stopped abruptly, eyes wide with terror. "There's someone in the plant. I swear I heard them calling my name." He was panting heavily, his voice shaky. I tried to reach you on the radio, but it wouldn't work. I went to open the office door, and it wouldn't open. It felt like something was holding it closed. He shuddered. Then, I heard my name again, clear as day. I didn't believe him at first. You're just tired. You need to calm down. But Dean wasn't calming down. He was visibly shaking, and I could see the terror in his eyes. We need to go back to the office, I said, trying to sound reassuring. We'll check the cameras and figure this out. But when we reached the door, we heard the receiving bell ring. The kind of bell that could only be triggered manually. And it kept ringing. I switched the camera feed to the exterior cameras, but there was no one there. Nothing. Yet. The bell kept ringing, the sound echoing through the empty hallways. Dean grabbed his jacket. I'm done, he said, voice trembling. I'm out. I can't do this anymore. He stormed out, leaving me alone in the office. I sat in silence, staring at the camera feeds, trying to rationalize everything that had happened. But my thoughts were interrupted by the sudden ringing of the doorbell again. I jumped out of my chair. I knew I needed to do something. I needed answers. I made my way to the plant manager's office, grabbed the spare keys, and headed down to the fuse room to reset the power. I had to try and fix something, anything, to make the bizarre events stop. As I flipped switches, the room grew colder. Way colder than it should have been. I heard a loud crash from the warehouse behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't look back. I rushed out, heading for the main entrance, when I heard a final, bone-chilling whisper. Behind me. Turn around. I stopped. My heart was hammering in my chest. Slowly, I turned. The hallway was empty. There was nothing. Whispers in the Walls story. 2 years ago, I worked as a security officer at a once popular motel called the Night's Inn. The motel, a sprawling, 2-story building near the county jail, had been in operation for almost 2 decades. Over the years, it had earned a reputation for hosting people who were, let's say, not exactly upstanding citizens. With the nearby jail offering a steady stream of freshly released prisoners, it wasn't unusual to see people with questionable backgrounds checking in. This made for an environment that was less than welcoming. The motel had originally been 2 separate properties, but about 5 years ago, the owners merged the 2 under one roof. The transformation was meant to draw in more customers. But it also seemed to attract something darker, a string of violent deaths, suicides, and drug overdoses. As I was later told, those dark events left behind what you could only call negative energy. The kind of energy that seeps into the walls of a building and stays there, lingering long after the people are gone. I had no idea about any of this when I first started working there. The staff didn't mention the history to me. My job was simple: patrol the grounds, ensure the place was secure, and handle any incidents. I didn't believe in ghosts. I didn't care much for horror stories. But after a few weeks on the job, I started to wonder if maybe there was more to this place than meets the eye. It all started in the final weeks before the motel shut down for major renovations. The place had become run down, its former charm overshadowed by its grim history. The new owners were determined to give it a facelift, but the building needed much more than just a fresh coat of paint. It needed an exorcism. On one of my overnight shifts, I was stationed in the kitchen area, assisting a night auditor. It was early in the morning, and we were preparing breakfast for the few remaining guests. The kitchen had once been part of an old, abandoned restaurant, and it still had that strange, musty smell. The auditor was busy filling pitchers of orange juice and mixing waffle batter when a sudden, ear-piercing explosion shook the air. A 12-pack of soda cans exploded on the counter next to a service stairwell. It was a sound I'll never forget, the cans popping in rapid succession, the noise echoing throughout the empty building. The auditor screamed, and I rushed over to her. My heart was pounding. No one had been near that area, and the service stairwell had been padlocked from the inside. 4 weeks. I quickly ran down the stairs to investigate, but there was no sign of anyone. The doors to the stairwell were still securely locked. I crouched down, dipped my finger into the puddle of spilled soda, and was surprised to find it cool to the touch, not even warm as if the cans had just overheated. Something didn't add up. As I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, the auditor, still shaking, gripped a small kitchen knife. "What the hell just happened?" she whispered, wide-eyed, staring at the empty kitchen. Before I could respond, we both heard it. A soft giggle. A little girl's laughter. But it wasn't the kind of giggle you'd expect from a happy child. It was high-pitched, unnerving, almost unnatural. We froze. The giggle came again, louder this time, echoing from the hallway behind us. Without thinking, we both bolted from the kitchen, heart racing, making a beeline for the main desk. We stood there, gasping for breath, trying to process what had just happened. 5 minutes later, the auditor, still pale, looked at me and said, "No one checked in any kids tonight." "I'm sure of it." I had no explanation for what we had just heard, but I knew this place wasn't like other motels. The following week, I was making my regular rounds. It was around 2 a.m., the time when the night seemed to stretch on forever. The motel was nearly empty, and the few remaining guests were keeping to themselves. The building was eerily quiet, except for the sound of my footsteps echoing through the hallway. I had just finished checking the doors when I received a call from the front desk. They needed me to come to room 211, code 6, priority. My heart skipped a beat. Code 6 meant something was wrong. Really wrong. I ran back to the office, nearly tripping on the staircase in the courtyard. When I arrived, I found a woman in hysterics, clutching her 3-year-old daughter. The mother was sobbing uncontrollably, her face pale with fear. Through her sobs, she managed to tell me that her husband, who had been acting strangely all night, had suddenly pulled a knife and started attacking her and their daughter. The woman insisted that he hated weapons, that he wouldn't have had a knife with him, yet here they were, trapped in a room with a man who had lost all control. I rushed to the room, only to find the man sitting in the courtyard, the knife still in his hand. He was staring ahead, unblinking, completely unresponsive. Blood stained his clothes. He had been bleeding for who knows how long. I ordered him to drop the knife. He didn't respond. I repeated my command, my hand hovering over my weapon, but he still didn't react. His blank expression gave me chills. On my third order, I drew my weapon and shouted at him to stop, thinking of the woman and child he had just threatened. At that moment, 2 local officers appeared behind me, their tasers drawn. "Taser, taser, taser," one of them shouted as they quickly subdued the man. They took him into custody. But something didn't sit right with me. As I filled out my statements, I overheard 2 deputies talking about a suspicious death in the very same room where the man had just been staying. They mentioned that it had been ruled a drug-induced suicide. But I couldn't help but feel something was off. Was it really just coincidence that this man had gone mad in the same room where someone else had died? Under mysterious circumstances? A few days later, I was on break when another officer suggested we test out a spirit box app on our phones. We were both skeptical, until that night. We decided to sit in the old restaurant area and see if we could pick up any strange signals. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. We were ready to call it quits and chalk it up to an overpriced app when suddenly, something came through the static. A voice, clear, but distorted, said, "Yellow gun." I froze. My colleague stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What the hell does that mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. I glanced around the room, confused. We were sitting in near darkness, our only light coming from the dim glow of our flashlights. But something felt off. I pulled out my taser and placed it on the table, hoping to illuminate the area. The moment I placed the taser on the table, the spirit box repeated, "Yellow gun." My heart raced. The voice sounded more distinct this time. I had no idea what it meant, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't just a random sound. It was as if the room itself was trying to tell us something. I turned the taser's light on, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then, my colleague swore loudly and stormed out of the room, cursing under his breath. I was left alone in the dark, wondering if we had just stirred up something we weren't supposed to. The final incident happened just after the motel closed for renovations. I was working a city patrol when the on-duty officer radioed for backup. A group of 4 to 6 individuals had broken into the back building and barricaded themselves in a room. I was the first to arrive at the scene. The night was quiet, too quiet, but when I met up with the officer in charge, we heard 3 gunshots ring out from the hallway. The tension in the air was thick, and my instincts screamed that something was wrong. We immediately called the sheriff's office, and within minutes, deputies in active shooter vests arrived. The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity. The suspect, it seemed, was watching us from inside the room, his eyes peering through cracks in the door and windows. "Stay out of the way," one of the supervisors ordered. "Block the entrances. No one enters. Except officers." We did as instructed, watching in silence as SWAT arrived and took over. I overheard a deputy talking about something strange, how one of the suspects had been muttering about ghosts just before the incident. And then, just as SWAT breached the room, we heard the suspect yell, "There will be more ghosts here tonight if you enter." I don't know what happened to the man after that. I don't know if he really died or if he became part of the restless spirits that haunted that place. But I've never felt more uneasy in my life. After that night, the company I worked for pulled out. We stopped providing security for the night scene. The building sat abandoned for months, closed off for renovations. When it reopened, it was no longer the gritty, run-down motel we had known. The owners had turned it into a trendy, hipster hotel, complete with sleek decor and high-end amenities. But every time I pass the property on patrol, I can't shake the feeling that something is still there. Something that wasn't driven out by the renovations. Something that's still lingering in the walls, in the shadows. I wonder if the ghosts are still there, quietly waiting for their next visitor. The Silent Wing Story. It was my second month working as a corrections officer at Hollow Creek Penitentiary, and I had already seen my fair share of unsettling moments. I was assigned to the solitary confinement unit, a small wing with 10 isolated cells, each designed for the worst. Offenders, those who had crossed lines, even within the prison's already tough confines. Most of the inmates here were violent, unstable, or dangerous, and they'd been placed in solitary for their own protection, or more likely, for ours. It wasn't a place for the faint-hearted, and despite the gloom of the job, it was routine, something I could manage. This morning, the air in the wing felt thick, suffocating even. The heavy steel doors, the cold, flickering lights, and the muffled sounds of distant murmurs filled the halls. The routine was simple: escort the inmates to the medical wing, check the exits, conduct security rounds, and ensure everything was secure. Simple. Until things started to change. Around 5 a.m., as I stood by the entrance to the solitary wing, I heard a faint sound, a woman crying. It was soft at first, barely a whisper in the distance, but unmistakable. I paused, my eyes scanning the empty corridor. There were no women here. Hell, there weren't even any women in this part of the penitentiary. The female unit was on the other side of the complex, and even there, I'd never heard anything like this. It didn't make sense. I looked toward the two inmates I was escorting to the medical wing, Thomas and Jake. They were both tough guys, hardened criminals who'd been in the system long enough to make anyone wary of their presence. They were silent for a moment, almost as if they hadn't noticed the sound. But when I looked up, I saw the subtle smirks on their faces. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice tight. Both of them looked at each other, then back at me, their expressions unreadable. "Every night, boss," Thomas said, his voice low and almost disinterested. "You get used to it." I frowned. Used to what? The crying. The knocks. The stuff in the walls. Jake, who hadn't spoken yet, shifted his weight, his eyes flicking toward the distant end of the hall. "Don't worry about it. You'll hear it more. No one really talks about it, but it's there. The place is haunted, you know." I chuckled nervously, more out of confusion than humor. "Haunted? You guys pulling my leg?" Thomas shook his head, his eyes empty. End quote. "You'll see. You'll hear it too, sooner or later." End quote. There was a heaviness in his voice, as if the weight of his words carried some dark knowledge. I didn't know what to make of it, but I also wasn't going to waste time asking too many questions. My job was to keep these men in check, not to try to decipher ghost stories. But as I led them down the hallway toward the medical wing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The sound of the woman crying had stopped, but the tension in the air remained thick. That was when I heard the knock. It started low, almost imperceptible, coming from one of the cells on the right side of the hall. I glanced around. All the cells were empty, the inmates locked away in their rooms for the night. The knock came again, louder this time. I froze, my eyes narrowing as I tried to determine where it was coming from. It sounded like it was coming from cell 7, the farthest one down the hall. I was supposed to perform a routine check on the exit doors, ensuring they were secure. It was part of my duties, something to keep my mind occupied. But now, the task felt insignificant compared to the strange noise echoing through the hall. I turned and began walking toward the end of the hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last. The knocking was persistent, like someone was knocking on the cell door, but no one was there. As I neared the end, the sound became louder, sharper, and closer. I hesitated for a moment at the doorway to cell 7. My pulse quickened, and a cold sweat began to form on the back of my neck. The knock came again, this time, it was unmistakable. Loud and clear, like it was right behind me. I spun around, expecting to see one of the inmates behind me, but there was no one. The hall was empty, except for the cold, sterile walls and the hum of the overhead lights. But the knocking didn't stop. It continued, now coming from the very cell I was standing in front of. My breath caught in my throat. I had seen enough horror movies to recognize a bad situation when I was in one. I reached for my radio, trying to keep my hands steady as I called into control. End quote. Control, this is Officer Parker. We've got an issue on the 7th floor. There's knocking coming from cell 7. No inmates are supposed to be in there. Over. End quote. There was a long pause on the other end, and then the voice of the dispatcher crackled through. Copy, Officer Parker. No inmates are scheduled for cell 7. Please confirm the status of the area. I swallowed hard, my eyes darting between the empty cell and the empty hallway behind me. The knocking had stopped. But I wasn't sure if that made it worse or better. End quote. Everything is secure, control. No sign of anything unusual. Over. End quote. I couldn't bring myself to look into the cell, not now. I'd heard the stories, of course. Old timers in the facility had spoken of things, strange occurrences, voices in the walls, shadows that moved when they shouldn't. But I always dismissed it as superstition. No one actually believed in ghosts, right? Except now, I wasn't so sure. As I made my way to the exit doors, I felt a sudden chill creep up my spine. The temperature in the hallway had dropped, and the oppressive silence felt suffocating. My flashlight flickered briefly, casting strange shadows across the walls. I turned it off, trying to reset the batteries, but the shadows didn't go away. They stretched unnaturally across the hallway, as if something, or someone, was just out of sight, lurking in the dark. Then came the whispers. Soft at first, like the wind, but then louder, clearer. It was a voice, a woman and #39's voice, crying. The sound was coming from behind the walls, echoing through the narrow corridors. My heart hammered in my chest, and I realized I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't sure when it happened, but the air felt crowded now, full of presences that weren't supposed to be there. I stood frozen, my mind racing, trying to rationalize it, but there was no escaping the reality of what I was hearing and feeling. The voice seemed to grow louder, more frantic, as if it were pleading for help, begging for someone to hear it. "Who's there?" I asked aloud, my voice shaky, but the question seemed futile, like a whisper lost in a storm. The knocking began again, this time much closer, coming from cell 7. I had no idea what was behind that door. I couldn't even be sure I wanted to find out. I reached for my keys, my hands trembling as I fumbled to unlock the door. The moment I inserted the key, a sudden, overwhelming wave of cold swept over me, and the lights flickered out. Complete darkness. I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable. Something was coming. I knew it. Then, a faint glow, a soft, eerie light, began to emerge from the cracks around the door, casting an unnatural illumination across the floor. It flickered like a candle, casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. The knocking ceased. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open, and what I saw stopped me in my tracks. Cell 7 was empty, as expected, but the walls were covered in something dark. Scratches, claw marks, and symbols that seemed to move when I looked away. In the center, of the room, on the floor, was an old, tattered sheet, stained dark in the middle. Before I could step inside, a voice, clear and unmistakable, whispered in my ear. End quote, leave now, end quote. I didn't wait for anything else. Without thinking, I slammed the door shut, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't care about protocol or procedure. I had to get out. Fast. I ran. I didn't stop. My footsteps echoed down the hallway, the whispers growing louder as I fled. The cold followed me, the cries of the woman ringing in my ears. The building seemed to shift, its walls closing in on me as I made my way back to the control room, my mind barely processing the reality of what had just happened. By the time I reached the exit, the whispers were gone. The temperature returned to normal. But I knew that something had changed. I never went back to cell 7. And I never spoke about what happened to anyone. Not the inmates, not my fellow officers, not even the warden. But from that night forward, I could never shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I wasn't alone. The woman's cries haunted me, and every time I passed the solitary wing, I couldn't help but wonder if there were things in that place, things that no one should ever see. Hollow Creek Penitentiary wasn't just a place for criminals anymore. It was a place for the lost, for the forgotten, and for those who had never really left. Hey everyone, Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to tonight's stories. I really hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you made it all the way to the end and aren't subscribed yet, well, that'd be awesome too. I put out new videos every week, so I hope you'll stick around. A huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons. You guys rock, and your names are right there on the screen. If you like this video, I think you'll enjoy this one too, so why not give it a watch? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.